So first off, I want to note, just like we talked about earlier, Slido is going to be one of the ways that you're going to interact during the session. And what's especially important about that is we are going to be picking 5 poll participants who are each going to win one of our keynote presenters' books. And you will hear a little bit about that. And then second, after the keynote is done, we're going to conclude with a little bit of Q&A if we have time. So as the session is going, drop some questions into the chat. I will be looking over them, and when our speaker is done, we will take a look at them and have a conversation. So with that preamble, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Torie Bosch. So not only is she the opinion editor for STAT, she's also an author, and she's a former editor for Future Tense. Now, after you hear her speak today, though, you will also undoubtedly want her on your next trivia team because she has a wealth of knowledge. So with that, Torie.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be here. Here I can share my screen, which should be, there we go. Technology, not so scary. As I said, Andy, thank you for a wonderful introduction, and thank you to all of you for having me today. My name is Torie Bosch, and I can't code. That might not be what you're expecting to hear from me, given what I'm here to talk to you about today, but I like to be clear about my limitations, and coding is one of them. If you show me a screenshot of code, I don't know what's going to say or what it means unless it's something really, really basic, like, say, the good old hello world or something along those lines. Nevertheless, I'm here today because I have spent a great deal of the last few years of my life examining the ways that humans interact with and produce computer code. So how it goes right, how it goes wrong, and what happens when it affects all of our lives. The result is a book, as Andy said, I edited, called You Are Not Expected to Understand This: How 26 Lines of Code Changed the World. It's made up of 26 essays written by technologists, historians, journalists, activists, and others looking at the very human stories behind some of the most consequential computer programming decisions from the past decades. Actually, it goes back more than decades, since the first story it tells is of the invention of binary code in 1725 by a French weaver. I think that people who don't work in tech like to think that code is something almost clinical or preordained, that software looks and acts the way it does because that was the only way to solve the problem, that it was meant to be. But as all of you know, in software, there is no meant to be. Code is created by human decisions, by your decisions, everyone here. And you're here because you care about using technology to create a brighter future for all of us. Unfortunately, the history of technology involves a lot of examples of people trying to do the right thing, only to accidentally create new problems. But by combining the stories of the past with some futurist thinking, you can develop tech in an ethical and equitable way. It's not about predicting the future, that's not your job. It's about creating a mindset that acknowledges a future is coming, rather than being focused on just getting through the day. So maybe you write code fluently and consider it part of your identity. Maybe you've just picked up some skills along the way to help your organization or learn something new. Maybe you consider yourself a low coder. Or maybe you, like me, don't know your Python from your JavaScript. But if you're here, that means the work you're doing is creating the 2020s, the 2030s, and beyond. So I would argue that you are expected to understand the power that code wields and how it has come to be. The process of coding may be about to undergo a massive transformation, one that could mean even the non-technical among us can create executable programs. But that makes it all the more important to adapt long-term thinking about programming. So we're going to start by talking about several examples of how short-term thinking can go haywire. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how I learned the power of programming, starting with pop music and a near apocalypse. So first up, we have the Backstreet Boys. When I was about 14, I became a huge fan, but no one else in my life would admit to liking them. So I turned, this is the late 90s, to this pretty new place called the World Wide Web. And there I found lots of Backstreet Boys fans. And they had websites on these services called GeoCities and Tripod and Angelfire, where you could host your own website for free. Keep the BSB pride alive, yes. So like the very cool person I decided that I had to have my own Backstreet Boys website as well. And it had to be a Backstreet Boys fan fiction site, no less. So to do that, I had to learn HTML, which is how I first started to learn about the power of the internet encode. I bought books. I learned how to view the source code on a website to see how someone else had built their frames back in the day. And I learned after making a whole lot of mistakes. And that meant that tween and teenage girls and some boys from around the world could come to my website where they could feast their eyes on this sort of marble green seafoam background with black text, which meant that it was really hard to read. Looking back on it, I knew nothing about accessibility at the time, much to my dismay today. And on that site, I posted my own stories in which the Backstreet Boys fell in love with me and my online friends. And then I started to host other people's stories where the Backstreet Boys fell in love with them and their online friends. And eventually, and I don't know why I insist on telling everybody this, but it became one of the biggest Backstreet Boys fan fiction sites online at the time. And while I was taking over the Backstreet Boys fan fiction world, programmers were dealing with something a little bit more important that you might have heard of, Y2K. Many of you probably remember this too, but for anyone who's too young, back in the day, computer memory was extremely limited. In fact, your iPhone has more than 1 million times more memory and RAM than the computer that took the first mission to the moon in 1969, which we'll be talking about a little bit in a minute. So to save space, programmers would use 2 digits to represent every year instead of 4. And that meant that computers assumed every year started with 19. And that worked great through the 1900s. But as the turn of the millennium started to creep up, people started to realize this is going to become a little bit of a problem. If we went from 1999 to 2000 without updating and patching this bug, then many computers would think that we had gone back in time to the year 1900 when it became the year 2000. And while it's hard for teenagers now to understand, even back in 1999, our lives really depended on computers for ATMs, for flight systems, for all sorts of things. Doomsday preppers started to stock up on food and supplies for the virtual end of the world, or perhaps I should say for the end of the virtual world. And now most people, of course, realize that the end of the world wasn't really going to come, but there were serious problems. So companies and governments and individual programmers around the world spent years and untold amounts of money racing to update the software by the new year. If you went to a hospital during that time, you might see stickers on machines that said Y2K OK to make it clear that each system had been updated. And in the end, all of this largely worked. There were problems when the calendar turned to January 1st, 2000. Some ATMs malfunctioned. There were issues with slot machines at racetracks in Delaware, which is funny to think about. But there are also some serious problems. In one really crucial example, in one corner of the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, some expectant mothers' birth dates were calculated incorrectly, which led to some life-altering outcomes for a very small number of people. But for most of us, everything went, well, pretty okay. And now I'd like to hear briefly from you. When you hear the phrase Y2K, what do you think? Tell me in the chat, please. Toilet paper and Y2K. That was exactly, Amy, well prepared. Water, So many hours testing applications, electric generators. I mean, it really was an interesting case study of this fusion of computer programming and religious fear, which is fascinating. Worrying about the home computer, panic, a lot of people working to make sure the world didn't explode, planes falling out of the sky, and a lot of fuss and panic over something that was solved. COBOL programmers. Oh, I love hearing all these Y2K memories. And we're going to get back to COBOL programmers in a second, too. I think it's interesting to see this balance between people saying that there was genuine concern and panic. A few months ago, in fact, I was speaking to a group in England about Y2K, and I made sort of a cheap joke about how programmers fixed the Y2K bug, but they also caused it. And my thinking there was really influenced by a story that my mother told. She spent a few years as a programmer in around the mid 70s. And as when Y2K was approaching, she started to tell the story about how in around 1975, when she was taking a class on programming, she asked an instructor, won't this whole 2-digit thing cause a problem when we reach the year 2000? And in her telling, the instructor laughed and said, well, by the time that comes around, that'll be someone else's problem. And to me, the moral of that story was that programmers were passing the buck. But in England, after my talk, a very nice older gentleman came up to me and told me that he had been a programmer in the 70s too. And he told me, you have to understand, in the 70s, it never occurred to us that people would still be using our code in 15 years, let alone in 30. And he had a really great point. You know, my mother's instructor likely hadn't meant it in a flippant way when he said that'll be someone else's problem. He just meant, of course, no one will still be using this code in almost 3 decades. Why would they? But he was extremely wrong. Oh, $200 in Y2K fees. I love that. That's hysterical. But the truth is that we don't just use 30-year-old code. We use 60 and 70-year-old code. When the pandemic hit and unemployment benefits were expanded in the US, people who had recently lost their jobs flooded their state government unemployment benefit systems. The websites crashed under the weight of applicants, and state governments had to rush to update the websites to accommodate the rush of traffic. But, and this goes back to the COBOL point, they struggled to find people who could do it because those sites had been coded decades earlier in COBOL. Today, no one learns COBOL. No one has learned COBOL in decades. And so in 2020, New Jersey had to issue a desperate plea for COBOL programmers to come out of retirement to update the state benefit system. There's a chapter of my book, You Are Not Expected to Understand This, on the coding of the Apollo guidance computer, which was used during the first lunar landing. And it offers a really interesting example of code lasting far longer than you expect, which goes to Paula's point to always consider the future when coding today. In this chapter, authors Ellen Stofan and Nick Partridge write that if you look at the code of the Apollo guidance computer, as with so many pieces of software, most pieces of software, you'll find comments. Many of them are dull, but some of them offer these really fascinating flashes of humanity. One of them, for instance, was an instruction to reposition an antenna that was labeled, crank the silly thing around, which I love, in order to go off to see the wizard. But my favorite part of the comment in this code is a section that made it into the final version that was marked temporary. I hope, hope, hope. And sometimes I like to think about that programmer who wrote that and what they were thinking as they watched the moon landing take place with their temporary I hope, hope, hope code. So now we're going to go to some Slido. How long term do you think when you code? I'll give everyone a minute to answer this. Oh, 5 years is winning. This is so long term. I'm so excited. Programming law. If you take the time to write future-proof code, it will be replaced next month, but your little temporary patch that was never meant to be a long-term solution will still be used in 20 years. I think that is exactly right. So we've got people thinking really long-term here. 5 years, 1 year, 10 year. I think that's really impressive. Amit, it should be something that you can click on or use the QR code. So if you can think 5 years while you're coding, that is super impressive. I also think that if you're thinking 5 years out, you're well ahead of the curve. I think a lot of the time people are only thinking up to lunch, to be honest, or getting to the next deadline. But we're going to talk now about what's wrong with that, or at least what's challenging about that. So I'm going to talk about several notable stories from You Are Not Expected to Understand This, starting with the cautionary tale of someone who was writing code for the present. Back in 1997, so soon before I became a pioneer in the highly competitive world of Backstreet Boys fan fiction, Ethan Zuckerman was a young programmer at Tripod, one of those free services where users could create their own websites. It was only free, of course, because the hosting company could insert ads onto your page. But as Ethan writes in You Are Not Expected to Understand This, his boss at Tripod told him that day in 1997 that they had a problem. An auto company had complained about their ad appearing on a personal homepage with some rather explicit content, the enduring problem of the internet. Ethan's boss asked him to figure out a way that they could sell ads while ensuring that brand managers wouldn't be sending furious emails about their brands appearing next to offensive content. So Ethan came up with an idea, and he wrote this line of code that you see here, illustrated by the wonderful Kelly Chudler. This code was inserted into the top of every personal homepage served at tripod.com. And when it loaded in a web browser, the code opened both the personal homepage the viewer wanted to see and another window. And that new window included Tripod branding, tools for navigating between different user-generated pages, and critically, a 200 by 200 pixel ad. And it was probably the world's first pop-up ad. A few weeks later, Tripod's leading competitor, GeoCities, copied Ethan's code, really just using that view page source that we talked about before, and used it to launch a similar window on their own pages. Not long after that, as Ethan writes, he saw a pop-up window appear with only an ad in it, none of that navigation. Then came pop-up windows that moved when you tried to close them. I remember chasing the pop-up around the screen, trying to close it. There were pop-unders that loaded below the web browser and that you only saw when you closed your main screen. There were pop-ups that spawned other pop-ups in a cascade of unwanted advertising that made you have to restart your computer and maybe even wish that you had never heard of the internet in the first place, as Ethan puts it. Now, when you think about the pop-up today, what comes to mind? I'd like to see some emojis. I'm seeing some heart faces, which I love. Lots of downs, lots of zipped faces. I asked before doing this to make sure that we didn't have a poop emoji, which I thought might happen. I think lots of people, as we see here, still have very strong feelings about the pop-up ad. And Ethan has learned that too. In 2014, Ethan wrote an article for The Atlantic about what he called the original sin of the internet, offering us free content in exchange for monetizing our attention and surveilling us. It was a very, very long essay, several thousand words, that included this very short aside that I highlighted here. It said, "I wrote the code to launch the window and run an ad in it. I'm sorry, our intentions were good." A very clever editor at The Atlantic who was working on that essay found that section and thought, people might be really interested in that. And so she pulled out that little quote and asked Ethan a couple more words about it, and I'll publish that separately alongside the longer article. So we have a multi-thousand word article about the business model of the internet, and we have about, I think it was 187 word article about creating the pop-up ad. So Which do you think got a lot more traffic on the internet? Yes, the 187-word article. Ethan's apology ricocheted across the internet and beyond, even appearing on late-night talk shows. And people were furious. As we saw from the emojis, I think many of us of a certain age still remember that frustration. Ethan actually, though, faced death threats and even swatting. So, which, as you probably know, is when someone calls law enforcement, reports a crime in progress that's not actually happening, and sends law enforcement with weapons to someone's house. It's an extremely dangerous situation. In the years since 2014, many technologists have told Ethan that, he's taking on individual blame in a way that he shouldn't. Ethan's code was clever, but he's the first to admit that it wasn't necessarily groundbreaking. If he hadn't written it, someone else probably would have or would have done something else equally annoying, given the way the internet works. But that raises this really important question, which is, does that mean no one person was responsible for the pop-up ad? That it was just capitalism and not the action of a single person? But as Ethan writes in You Are Not Expected to Understand This, there's a problem with refusing to accept responsibility for making the web a more terrible place. And the problem is that it releases you from the responsibility to make it a better place. Today, Ethan is working at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and trying to create alternatives to the commercial internet. I recently asked him to give some advice to his younger self and to younger programmers. And he told me, that snippet of code you expect to be replaced by something better in 2 weeks, there's a 5 to 10% chance that it's still going to be in use 20 years from now. You may not have time to write it as if it's going to last 20 years. Hell, you might not be smart enough to write it as if it's going to last 20 years. But you can write a note to your future self or the poor programmer who has to clean up your spaghetti code so that she knows what you were trying to do. Comments are notes to your future self, and they are gifts from programmers long gone. Leave gifts for whoever has to suffer your terrible code, which I think is great advice to all of us. I'd love to hear from you all about comments. Have you read any comments in code that have stuck with you? Please share it in the chat. Yes, comments are so essential. Anyone come to mind? Apologies. I love apologies in code. Those of you who think a lot about code may, please ignore this. You may also be familiar with the comment that gave my book its title, You Are Not Expected to Understand This. Please don't use. I don't know why I had to do this. Data was written, which is fantastic. We don't think this part is needed, but when we remove it, it breaks. I love all of these. This is hysterical. It's so much fun. We can see a little glimpse of people. Sorry, but no banana. I love that. Future pain is a great way to think about. Fubar. I love all of these. I want to write them down and include them the next time I write a book about code, perhaps, or edit a book. All right, so now we have a slightly less fun story, unfortunately, about long-term thinking in code. This one has far more serious consequences than the pop-up ad. And it also shows how computer systems, far from being somehow objective, reflect human values, biases, and assumptions. In You Are Not Expected to Understand This, Charlton McIlwain, a historian of technology at New York University, writes that in 1965, US President Lyndon Johnson created a commission to study the causes of and find solutions to America's crime problem. The commission included one task force that was supposed to introduce new computational solutions to crime. The president justified the task force's work by pointing to computing technology success in war, national defense, and space exploration. In time, the central focus of the task force became something called the police beat algorithm, which you can see a snippet of here. It was designed to help police departments divide up municipal areas and determine how to deploy resources to those areas, sending the most resources, meaning law enforcement, to the places with the most crime. But the problem was that the police beat algorithm had to use historical data to decide where to direct those resources. And Black people were far more policed than white people. So the task force used data that was biased because Black people were far more likely to be caught committing a crime, even if they were not more likely to actually commit one. And so that made the input, the historical crime itself, biased. If the input is biased, so is the output. It told police to target Black and brown communities for profiling, surveillance, and patrol. The police beat algorithm was intended as a proof of concept, but it was actually implemented in 1968 in Kansas City, Missouri. The algorithm led police officials to make tactical decisions to concentrate personnel and deploy weapons in what was essentially the whole of East Kansas City, which has the vast majority of the city's Black citizens. And ultimately, the police beat algorithm became thousands of similar systems. These algorithms have grown to include facial recognition, mobile surveillance, risk assessment, and other such tools, and they're used from local law enforcement to international security. And the same logics and assumptions that motivated the creation of the police beat algorithm more than 50 years ago continue to show up in contemporary law enforcement technology. Today, when we talk about law enforcement algorithms, people really like to invoke the 2002 Steven Spielberg movie Minority Report, in which a system can predict to the second when a crime will occur. But the thing is, in Minority Report, the system is basically just magic. In the movie, we don't really know where the ability to predict the future comes from. We get this kind of weird backstory about these three people who float in this goo and their brains were changed by some virus they contracted. But it's really just an excuse to do the thought exercise. But in reality, we don't know exactly what's in the algorithms used by predictive policing systems, such as how they weight particular variables, that sort of thing, because they're proprietary systems. But we do know how they fundamentally work. Like the police beat algorithm, they map out the past and just project it onto the future without taking into account the ways that data itself can be biased. Assuming the future is like today, just more so, is extremely risky in programming or anywhere else, really. Now we're going to go to the late 1980s, when the internet was still pretty new. And though at the time, a handful of computer scientists were voicing concern about the havoc that could ensue if a rogue program got loose on the network, no one was prepared when it actually happened on November 2nd, 1988, as journalist Katie Hafner describes in You Are Not Expected to Understand This. At 8:30 that evening, a 23-year-old Cornell University computer science graduate student named Robert Morris unleashed just such a program on the network. His motivation was more curiosity than malevolence. His program was intended as a harmless hack, just to see that it could be done. His program was supposed to copy itself from computer to computer and simply take up residence in as many machines as possible, hiding in the background to escape detection by computer users. Using several bugs he found in the Unix source code, Morris designed the program to first steal passwords by reading through a list of users on the target computer. And then it would run through their names or permutations of their names and a list of commonly used passwords. As a quick aside here, in 2022, according to research released by the maker of a virtual private network, the most common password in the world was still password. Number 2 was 123456. And number 3, for people who wanted just a little bit of extra security, was 1234567889. I know nobody here would use such a password, but if you are, no shame. Please just consider changing it and maybe get a password manager. It's make life so much easier. So back to Robert Morris. When his program was successful in guessing a password, his program then signed on to the machine and masqueraded as a legitimate user in order to copy itself to a remote machine. Now, he didn't want to break the internet, so he devised a mechanism to keep the program from propagating too swiftly. And then he went out to dinner. By the time he got back from dinner, he realized that the mechanism to keep the program under control had not worked. So technically, this was a worm rather than a virus. So a virus remains dormant until the infected host file is activated, at which point it executes its code. A worm doesn't require that activation of the host file. Once a worm enters the system, it can self-replicate and run and propagate without any triggering event. And even when Morris's program's attempts to get into a new computer were unsuccessful, it was basically just knocking on the door over and over, and that was often enough to render the machine useless. Within a few hours, the program had crashed thousands of computers at universities, research institutions, and, crucially, federal government facilities across the United States. Computer managers stayed up all through the night trying to fend off the worm as it hopped back and forth over the internet. At one lab at a university in California, someone wrote CDC on a sign and taped it to the door because it felt like they were trying to attack the outbreak of a pandemic all of a sudden. Some people worried that it was the opening salvo in a series of attacks. Before the Morris worm, this sort of malware was seen more as a theoretical problem than a real one. And the network was sort of like a rural town where everyone pretty much knew everyone else and people leave their doors unlocked. The Morris worm changed everything. Morris was charged with a single felony count under the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a law that was itself partially inspired by a 1983 Matthew Broderick movie called War Games, which I highly recommend. It's a fun one to watch. Morris was the first person to be charged under a provision of the law that made it illegal to gain unauthorized access to federal computers, which makes sense if you've seen War Games. He was convicted, but the judge decided to be lenient and sentenced him to community service. Eventually, Morris finished his PhD at Harvard. He made a fortune in the computer industry, and he became a tenured professor at MIT. And in all the years since, he hasn't spoken publicly about the worm and its legacy. And that brings us to our final example from You Are Not Expected to Understand This. This chapter was written by Will Oremus, a former colleague of mine who is now at the Washington Post. Back in 2007, Facebook had about 30 million users, which at the time seemed very impressive, even if it's small compared to today's 1 billion. But interacting with your friends' posts required at least a little bit of friction. You had to actually type something. And that meant that many comments ended up being really low effort. So you would post about an engagement or a new job, and there would just be a very long series of congratulations. And that made it really difficult for users, and frankly, for people at Facebook, to find the more substantial comments. Plus, Facebook was striving for a really clean aesthetic, and they thought it just looked really ugly to have these long chains of boring comments. Worst of all, they thought it made them look like MySpace. So some Facebook folks started to think about a way to create a low-effort manner in which users could engage. They called this project Props. Leah Pearlman, who worked on the project, told Will Oremus, "I felt like I was cleaning the garage by adding the like button. I never expected what happened. We were working on other things at the time that felt like a bigger deal by far." According to Will's reporting, at least a couple of people there imagined there could be some problems with what they were trying to do, this low-effort engagement. They were worried that it would eliminate thoughtful engagement because people are lazy and would take the lazy way out. This props project became called the Awesome Button, which is what most of the people on the team liked to call it. But eventually, Mark Zuckerberg forced them to change the name to the like button because he didn't like the phrase awesome button. And as Will writes, in terms of sheer impact, the like button was one of the most successful pieces of code ever shipped. But when you examine the quality of that impact, its flaws become glaring. In building a feature whose primary function was to simplify the terms of interaction with online content, Facebook understood it risked cheapening engagement. What it failed to anticipate was that it might lead to a cheapening of the content itself. They couldn't have foreseen Cambridge Analytica or fake news or the clout chasing that affects teens' mental health or the geopolitical consequences. Like Ethan Zuckerman with the pop-up ad, they just wanted to fix the problem in front of them, which really boiled down to differentiating themselves from MySpace. Eventually, they succeeded. They won. But many of the people who worked on it now have very complicated feelings about that effort. I'd like to see some emoji reactions here too. So what do you think about the like button? But I also don't want to just use some cheap engagement. So I'd love to see some comments as well. We got some thumbs up, we got some thumbs down, which is of course the like button itself, which is ironic. I really can't tell whether people are mostly pro or con. You're right, Harry, it is a button. But it's a button that ended up having these consequences that people couldn't have imagined. Eric, I agree that ethics is really important in technology as we continue to march. I think that's a great point, Amy, that the way it's been used by Facebook is a dislike, but there possibly could be other ways to implement it. I think that what all of these stories show us is that code is human. And that's true even when it comes to generative AI like ChatGPT. Today, you can ask ChatGPT to write a simple program for you and it'll work. As I mentioned, I really don't know any programming, but I asked ChatGPT to write a program for me that calculates the day of the week someone was born, and it did, as you can see here in Python. I'm really cautious about AI hype right now. I mean, I think that, I've seen cryptocurrency and the metaverse and massively open online courses. Remember when MOOCs were supposed to completely change the university? So what's hyped today in technology might not be the case tomorrow. Having said that, I do think that it's very possible programming jobs might look quite different 10 years from now. But even if an AI is writing code, it's still going to be human in many ways. So remember the police beat algorithm and how its predictions are a reflection of data generated by humans. Generative AI like ChatGPT is still built on people, on what we've written online, on what we've programmed. So even written by AI, then it's a reflection of this humanity, of our values, of our assumptions, our priorities, and our biases. And you are not expected to understand this. Meredith Broussard, who is a computer science and journalism professor, writes that when same-sex marriage was legalized in the US, it required changing thousands of database schemas. The database redesign process was called, and I really love this, Y2Gay. Most databases had been set up decades before to only allow marriage between men and women, so changing the law meant changing the databases to comply. Meredith phrases this really beautifully. Computer systems are not just mathematical, they're socio-technical, and they need to be extensively updated on a regular basis, just like humans. A few days ago, I asked Meredith to share some other thoughts on long-term thinking in code. She told me, "We build computer systems for the world as it is today, but the world will change and we'll have to update systems." This was something I only began to realize as an adult after I'd lived through multiple decades and seen my code and my writing age and disappear. Relatedly, this wisdom from age is why it's good to have intergenerational teams building technology instead of what we currently do, which is fetishize youth in tech culture. We want to build code as if we can set it and forget it, but ground conditions change and ground truth changes. ChatGPT, for example, has an end date of 2021, which is the last date on which training data was collected. So anything that happened after its end is not in the training data, meaning its perspective is a few years behind. Or in other words, ChatGPT doesn't know about the latest Taylor Swift album. So we started with the Backstreet Boys, and now we're on Taylor Swift. So thank you, good people of Blackbaud, for indulging me as I use pop culture to talk about these topics. But more seriously, just as ChatGPT is not built to understand the present, human brains are simply awful about thinking about the future. The futurist Jane McGonigal wrote about this in 2017 for Slate in an article that I edited. She wrote, "Our future selves are strangers to us. This isn't some poetic metaphor. It's a neurological fact. Functional MRI studies suggest that when you imagine your future self, your brain does something weird. It stops acting as if you're thinking about yourself. Instead, it starts acting as if you're thinking about a completely different person. This glitchy brain behavior may make it harder for us to take actions that benefit our future selves, both as individuals and as a society. Studies show that the more your brain treats your future self as a stranger, the less self-control you exhibit today, and the less likely you are to make pro-social decisions, choices that will probably help the world in the long run." I don't know about you. If you've experienced this language, please tell us in the chat, but I've certainly experienced it myself. For almost 12 years, I edited Future Tense, which was a partnership of Slate, Arizona State University, and the think tank New America that covered the future, specifically the intersection of technology, policy, and society. I was supposed to cover what was going to happen in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. And at first, I did that pretty well. I let things get pretty weird. I once ran an article about whether we should sentence the worst criminal offenders to living longer lives instead of shorter ones. An idea I don't necessarily endorse, but an interesting thought experiment. But over time, I found my own future timeline shrinking. I started to get focused on just making it through that day's technological news. I justified it to myself by saying that I was trying to avoid hype, and to some extent that was true. I didn't want to declare some new technology to be the next big thing only for it to fail. But I also didn't want to debunk cutting-edge science that my general interest readers hadn't even heard of. So I found myself just getting caught up in the churn of what Elon Musk had done recently. And I think this applies to thinking about technological projects too. Like Ethan Zuckerman with the pop-up ad, you want to solve the problem in front of you, the problem your boss or your client wants you to fix. It might seem a little egotistical to think that you're working on something before lunch that could end up having major ramifications for the future. And the truth is that most of what you're working on today, or what any of us are working on today, probably doesn't have the power to affect major change. But some of what you're working on might, in ways you can't quite expect. So think about Y2K and the marriage databases that people built in the mid-20th century. They had no concept, probably, most of them, that someday their descendants might embrace gay marriage or even get gay married themselves. Many of them were probably gay and still couldn't have imagined a technological world in which the databases would have to reflect gay marriage. One thing that can really help with shifting with this sort of thinking is to shift from thinking about the future to futures plural. If you think about a series of possible tomorrows instead of a predetermined destination in time, that can be a really useful framework. And then instead of feeling like you're trying to predict the future, it feels like you're just anticipating paths forward. I talked a little bit about Minority Report earlier and how it could be a stumbling block in thinking about the ethical consequences for AI and law enforcement. But it does offer one useful lesson, which is showing a worst case scenario for a system going wrong. So along those lines, when you're thinking through projects, it can be useful to imagine how they might become part of a dystopic system. You know, it's kind of a fun exercise. You get to play sci-fi author. You can ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? How might someone use this product to do harm? How might this product create harm even if no one means for it to? What assumptions are we building in? What biases might we not be thinking about? So tell yourself a story, or even yet several stories. Now I'd love to hear from you all using the QR code or the link. What's your favorite movie about the future? We're going to see if this can grow into a little word cloud. I, Robot, absolutely. Matrix, Demolition Man, Foundation, AI, The Circle, Back to the Future, Terminator, Arrival, I Am Legend. This is amazing. Keep them coming, guys. Back to the Future, yes. Idiocracy, absolutely. Terminator, Blade Runner, Dune. I want to do a movie festival for myself with all of these this weekend, I think. Who wants to join me? Wall-E, 1984. Dragon Ball Z, yes. Interstellar, I love this. Let's go for another 30 seconds or so before we move on, just because I'm really loving this. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, yes, Ed, I love that one. Gattaca. So many of these are dystopian, but to Ben Wong's point, not all of them, I think. Back to the Future has some dystopic elements, but actually it's a great, or Back to the Future 2 at least, but it's a great example of how we can do these versions, these scenarios about what the future might look like. Hot Tub Time Machine, I haven't seen that one. Spaceballs. I think it's really useful to remember that, again, the future doesn't have to be dystopian. We don't only want to think about the future in terms of Black Mirror. It's far more useful to think about lots of different kinds of futures. Futurists often call this scenario building, and it started in the 1970s with an oil company, Shell. Well, there are lots of ways to experiment with scenario building. At a core level, it's basically just writing narratives about what might happen. So often there's a heaven scenario in which everything goes the way you might want it to. The Jetsons might be that. There's often a pragmatic scenario in which things go basically as planned with some hiccups along the way. And then there's what we call the hell scenario, in which everything goes wrong or one part goes wrong in a really tremendous way. And there are other scenarios that you can sketch out too, like a black swan scenario, which is when something wildly unexpected happens. And then you can ask yourself, with all these scenarios, how will your project react? And this isn't just fun to do, though as an aspiring sci-fi writer, I think it's a blast. It's also good for the future, or again, the futures. Because whether you're writing the code or an AI is writing it, it's going to be yours. You cannot be expected to anticipate all the ways that things can go wrong. As I said before, it's not your responsibility to predict the future. But I think that it is your responsibility to imagine these possible futures, to imagine how your work, as prosaic as it may seem at times, might fit in. Your work will be stronger for it, and maybe it'll also help turn your future self into a bit less of a stranger. Thank you all so much for having me. I'd love to answer questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, Torie. We'll wait a second or two to see if any questions pop up in the chat. And I thought of at least two while you were going. So we'll see if we end up getting one of those.
I love all of these emojis. They're delightful.
Yeah. Well, I will ask one because we probably have time for just one question before we have the next session. So I will ask, what's your opinion on our role or responsibilities when it comes to AI and thinking about the future?
I mean, I think our role, well, it depends. So who's R here? So is this R as in people working in tech, or R as in all of us?
Yeah, I would say people working in tech.
I think the responsibility is to just have conversations. So one thing that when I started working with Future Tense back in 2011, which was a moment of this really intense tech optimism, as people probably remember, right? There's this moment when it felt like Facebook will bring us all democracy, for instance, that it will fix everything. And I started to hear, though, from people in Silicon Valley and computer scientists saying that they thought that people in tech were just talking to each other too much, and that it was creating this bubble in which techno-optimism was going really unchallenged. And so one thing I think is really important if you work in tech is talk to folks who don't, think about what they're excited about, learn what they're nervous about and answer their questions. I think it's really, really important to bring together all of these voices because the future you all are creating is not just for you, it's for the rest of us too. So thinking through how this affects everybody, listening to people even when, they don't know their HTML from their Python is really, really important.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Torie. Everybody, if we can throw some emojis up for Torie. Um, really appreciate you joining us today and chatting with us.